Danielle stepped into the crowded courtroom, her sharp eyes scanning every corner. She wasn't there by chance. This was part of her plan. Beneath the casual clothes and low-profile appearance lay a brilliant federal prosecutor determined to uncover bias in the justice system. Today's target was Judge Harold Grayson, infamous for his discriminatory rulings and harsh treatment of defendants who didn't fit his narrow standards. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the judge entered. J. Grayson Baldwin, imposing glare, exuded authority. His reputation for being unkind to minorities was well known, but hard to prove. Daniel's goal wasn't just to observe, it was to expose him. As she slipped into the back row, Grayson's cold eyes landed on her, his brows furrowed as though her presence alone offended him. Without hesitation, he leaned into the microphone and addressed her. Miss, this isn't a casual gathering. This is a courtroom, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. Shouldn't you be somewhere else, like maybe figuring out how this process works? The comment drew a few awkward chuckles from the audience, though many avoided meeting Dan's gaze. She held her ground, ignoring the insult as if it hadn't even registered. Instead, she calmly pulled out a notebook and began jotting down observations. Judge Grayson squinted, clearly irked by her lack of reaction. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he turned his attention to the proceedings. That kept her expression neutral, but inside her determination only grew stronger. She wasn't just there for herself, she was there for every person who had suffered under this man's gavel. The case proceeded, and Dan didn't have to wait long to see Grayson's bias in action. The first defendant, a young white man, stood nervously at the podium, charged with theft. Grayson's tone was calm, almost sympathetic. I understand. Mistakes happen, the judge said, his voice softening. You're young. Let's not ruin your future over this. The sentence, say, minor fine in community service. Next up was a black teenager charged with a similar crime. Grayson's demeanor shifted dramatically. His voice grew cold and judgmental as he glared at the boy. Young man, he snapped, this kind of behavior shows a complete lack of respect for the law. Society cannot function with people like you causing chaos. The sentence, jail time. Dan now clenched her pen, furious but silent. She watched as the cycle continued. Leniency for some, harshness for others, all based on race. As the hearing took a short recess, Grayson's gaze once again fell on Dan. This time he made no effort to hide his contempt. Still here, miss, he sneered. Maybe you should spend less time loitering in courtrooms and more time finding a real job. You know, something more fitting. Daniel locked eyes with him, her face calm, but her mind racing. She could see it clearly now. Grayson didn't just judge cases, he judged people based on their skin color, and he did it with no remorse. Her confidence remained unshaken. Every word, every action was being noted, forming the foundation of the justice she would soon deliver. For now, she let him believe he was in control. Little did he know his days as a judge were numbered. The case was over, and the room had settled into an uneasy, quiet. Judge Grayson shuffled his papers, his gavel echoing sharply as he called for a recess. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, with people whispering about the unfair rulings they had just witnessed. Dan, still seated in the back, watched as the judge stood up from his bench, his beady eyes locking on her. Miss, he said, loudly, motioning toward her in a dismissive manner, I've noticed you've been taking notes the entire time. Are you planning to write a book about my courtroom? His voice dripped with mockery, and a few people in the room snickered. Danielle remained calm, keeping her notebook closed. Her heart raced with anticipation, but she knew the moment had arrived. She stood slowly, collecting her things with deliberate precision. The murmur of the room quieted as all eyes turned to her. Judge Grayson, she said, her voice steady but filled with authority. You're right, I've been taking notes, but not just for a book. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a leather-bound folder, the official seal of the federal government embossed on the front with a slow and deliberate motion. Daniel flipped it open and held up her credentials for all to see. Dan Jones, she stated clearly, her eyes never leaving Grayson's shocked face. Federal prosecutor. A stunned silence fell over the room. People exchanged glances, trying to process what they had just heard. Even the judge froze for a moment, the color draining from his face. Dana continued, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Judge Grayson, I'm here as part of an ongoing investigation into complaints of racial bias and misconduct within this courtroom, and I must tell you today, you've proven every single one of them to be true. The room went completely still, the words hanging in the air. Judge Grayson's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. He sputtered, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, unable to find the right words to defend himself. This is absurd, he finally blurted out. You don't belong here. I had no idea who you were. Dan held up her hand, cutting him off. It's not about who I am, Judge Grayson. It's about what you've been doing in this courtroom, how you've been treating people when you think no one's watching, and now everyone here has seen your actions for what they really are. The room remained silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Grayson's smirk was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. The people who had been silent observers moments ago now stared at him with clear judgment in their eyes. Dan calmly sat back down, her job just beginning. Grayson's true identity was no longer hidden behind a gel. The investigation had only just begun. Judge Grayson stood behind his bench, visibly sweating. His hands trembled as he glanced around the courtroom, desperate for anyone to back him up, but there was only silence. Dan now had just shattered his world, and the pieces were scattered across the courtroom floor. He tried to regain control, but his voice faltered. This is a misunderstanding. You must have misinterpreted my actions. I didn't know who you were. His words stumbled into one another, his facade crumbling with each syllable. Daniel's gaze remained unflinching, her calm composure contrasting with Grayson's visible panic. No, Judge Grayson, she said softly, but her words carried the weight of an undeniable truth. It's not about who I am. It's about how you treat people when you think no one is watching, and I've been watching. I've seen your actions. She stood up slowly and walked toward the front of the courtroom, every step echoing with purpose. All eyes were on her as she placed a file on the judge's bench. With a cool precision, she began to pull out evidence, cases, transcripts, and court records. I've reviewed your history, Judge, she said, her voice clear and strong. Your rulings, your treatment of defendants, and I've found a pattern of racial bias and injustice. Time and time again, you've shown preferential treatment toward white defendants while subjecting people of color to harsher sentences. I have documented proof. The courtroom shifted as people leaned forward, hanging on her every word. Daniel pulled out a series of printed documents pointing to specific instances. Here's one: a young black man charged with a minor theft sentenced to 5 years in prison, and here a white defendant with the same charge sentenced to community service. The disparity is glaring. Judge Grayson's face was turning red now, but he couldn't say a word. His silence spoke volumes. Danielle was relentless, laying out case after case, each one painting a picture of systemic racism and unfair treatment under his rulings. I'm not just accusing you, Judge, Dan continued. I'm holding you accountable for your actions. These aren't isolated incidents. They are part of a pattern that can no longer be ignored. Grayson's arrogance had evaporated, replaced by sheer panic. You can't do this, he shouted, his voice cracking. You don't have the authority to. Dana raised her hand, cutting him off. I am the authority here, Judge. The law is the authority, and you've broken it. She turned to the court, her voice unwavering. I'll be submitting this evidence to the appropriate authorities. An investigation into your actions will begin immediately. Grayson stood frozen, his eyes darting nervously around the room. The gavel had fallen not just on a case, but on his career, and for the first time he realized the true power of accountability. Danielle walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. The fight was far from over, but the first victory had already been won. Danielle wasted no time after her bold revelation. In the courtroom, she immediately set the wheels of justice in motion. The federal prosecutor knew that exposing Judge Grayson's racism wasn't enough. It was time for real consequences. The following morning, she filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Oversight Committees, ensuring that a full investigation would be launched into Grayson's conduct behind the scenes. The things were happening fast. The committee began reviewing Grayson's rulings, pulling case files from the past several years. Dana had already provided them with a mountain of evidence, inconsistencies in sentencing, discriminatory remarks from the judge, and testimonies from lawyers who had witnessed his biased behavior. Weeks passed, and the walls seemed to close in on Judge Grayson. He tried to maintain his innocence, clinging to his usual excuses, misunderstandings, and his aided incidents, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward, recounting moments when Grayson had shown clear favoritism toward white defendants and treated people of color with disdain. Danya, now leading the charge, worked tirelessly with the oversight committees to ensure Grayson would not escape accountability. The media caught wind of the investigation, and soon the story spread like wildfire. The public was outraged, but for Dana, the work was just beginning. She couldn't rest until she knew that Grayson would face the full consequences of his actions. Finally, the announcement came. Judge Harold Grayson was suspended from his position pending further investigation. The judicial inquiry was underway. Grayson's reputation, once untouchable, was now in free fall. His arrogance had caught up with him, and the people who once feared him were now speaking out. The inquiry, which lasted for several months, revealed the disturbing pattern in Grayson's rulings. Cases where Black, Hispanic, and other minority defendants were sentenced far more harshly than their white counterparts, even when the circumstances were virtually identical. Then came the final blow. The court released an official statement condemning Grayson's actions. His behavior was deemed unacceptable, and he was forced to resign. In disgrace, the hammer of justice had come down hard, but it was a victory for those who had suffered at Grayson's hands. Dan had not only exposed the bias, but also paved the way for real change. She stood tall as the judge's resignation was announced, knowing that this was just the beginning of a broader movement toward fairness in the justice system. Daniel's courage didn't just change one courtroom, it ignited a wave of reform. Her actions exposed the deeply rooted racism that still lingered in the justice system, and as a result, the nation began to take a hard look at how judges were held accountable for their decisions. The judicial system, once shrouded in secrecy, started to open its doors to public scrutiny across the country. People who had suffered under biased judges began to speak out. Daniel's bravery gave them the strength to come forward and share their stories. Their voices echoed through the halls of justice, demanding reforms that would ensure equal treatment for all. In the wake of Grayson's resignation, several states introduced new policies aimed at addressing racial bias in the courtroom. Mandatory bias training for judges became a focal point, and transparency in judicial decisions was prioritized. Daniel's work didn't just put an end to Grayson's career, it inspired a nationwide movement to hold the powerful accountable. The media celebrated Danya as a hero. Headlines across the nation praised her for exposing the corruption in the judicial system. She was hailed as a trailblazer for justice, a young woman who refused to let the systemic racism she had witnessed go unchallenged, but didn't let the attention go to her head. She knew her work was far from finished. One victory didn't erase the years of injustice that had come before. There was still much to be done, and Dan was determined to continue the fight. In the final scene, Dan stood before a group of aspiring young lawyers at a conference, the room packed with eager faces looking to her for guidance. The energy was electric, and Dan could feel the weight of the moment. She stood tall at the podium, her eyes scanning the room. "I know many of you have big dreams," she began, her voice steady and confident, "but you'll face obstacles. You'll encounter people who will try to bring you down, will try to make you feel like you don't belong. But let me tell you something, never let anyone's bias dim your light. Justice belongs to all of us, and it's up to us to fight for it." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. Then a quiet cheer erupted as the young lawyers stood and applauded, inspired by the woman who had made history. Daniel smiled, knowing that the next generation would carry the torch she had lit, and with them the promise of a more just world.